Are the New Testament books of Luke and Acts fiction? Well, Dr. Paula Fredriksen seems to think so. Let's find out if the evidence supports her claim.
Well, all rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Welcome back. It's your host once again, Derek Caldwell, with author and speaker Abdu Murray. You didn't know I was going to do this, but before we jump into the video, right. I just want to say, because you've never mentioned this before in a podcast, even though we don't tell you, you can sit. After you never tell them, you may now be seated after all rise. I'm just afraid people have been standing watching this show for 2 seasons now. Yeah, and we just want everyone to know that they can
never sat down.
Hey, they have not sat down. So just know it's kind of we're being kind of creative. You don't have to take it so literally.
Yeah. Please don't take it literally.
Yeah. So I just wanted to clear that up, and then we can move on. So today we are talking about, as you heard at the top of the show, we're talking about Dr. Paula Fredriksen, highly respected New Testament scholar, a critical New Testament scholar.
Indeed.
I don't know if she's a Christian of some sort or not.
I don't get the impression that she is.
Yeah, I don't get the impression that she is, but we're going to watch this video now and hear some claims she made about Luke and Acts being basically fiction.
It's a long clip. But it's important that we get the full context of what Dr. Fredriksen is saying, because we don't want to respond to something she's not actually saying. Right. So it's a long clip, so bear with us a little bit. Yeah. I think that you'll get the full context here, but we want to wait till we react to the full clip itself. Yeah.
And just to remind everyone too, real quick, we're going to respond to what we think are kind of the most important staggering claims really she's making. We won't be able to get to everything, but any lingering questions, bring them to us. Every time we do an episode of All Rise, a week later we'll have deliberations live. If you subscribe to us, subscribe to our channel, you'll get notifications when we go live. Bring any lingering questions you have about these clips to that show. And you can put comments on this video. You can email us at mail@embracethetruth.org. Sorry. We will get to those questions. So, here we go.
First of all, people want to think that Luke is a travel companion of Paul because of the we passages. And the reason scholars date Acts to the early 2nd century is because of the word Christian, which shows up in Luke, which appears and clusters in early 2nd century texts, both in Pliny and in Tacitus and in Ignatius and in Luke, Acts. So if Luke Acts is writing then, he's awfully long-lived if he was a companion of Paul. If he was a companion of Paul, he hadn't read Paul's letters, because there are some head-on collisions with the material in, say, Galatians and the material in Luke. Luke has Paul start out in Jerusalem, be commissioned by, this is all fantasy, because the high priest didn't even have authority over the Dead Sea Scroll community, and they're right down the street, right? He's deputizing Paul to go all the way to Damascus to crash heads and drag Christians back to Jerusalem for I don't know what end. And Paul is on the road to Damascus, and he has this experience. And then he goes immediately back as soon as he can, back to Jerusalem. Paul says that he implies that he was in Damascus the whole time. He resists this movement before he has his transitional experience. Then he says he goes away to Arabia, which is Roman Arabia, not Saudi Arabia. He goes east for 3 years, which however long a period that is. And then he goes back to Damascus, he says. And then after several years, I go up to Jerusalem. So you can't both go back to Jerusalem immediately after your so-called conversion experience and go after 3.5 years. So I think that's a problem. The other thing is what Paul doesn't mention that Luke attributes to Paul. When Paul is boasting of his Jewish credentials, how he was circumcised on the 8th day of the people Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrew parents, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. I got a PhD under Gamaliel. It's not there. When he talks about, I persecuted the ecclesia, the assembly of God, and tried to destroy it, never mentioned Stephen. why not? I mean, if those were such fundamental moments in his biography. So there are the gaps that Paul doesn't mention from Luke, and there are the collisions that Acts has with Paul's letters. And for that reason, I don't think the author Luke was familiar with Paul's letters, or if he was, he wasn't reading them very carefully.
Okay.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. A lot of claims to get to.
Mm-hmm.
So Paula Fredriksen is basically, if we kind of boil that down, there are two basic claims that she's making with a lot of details that we're going to try to get to a lot of those. Mm-hmm. But first is that the Gospel of Luke and Book of Acts were written too late to be based on eyewitnesses or a travel companion of Paul. Mm-hmm. So that clearly disqualifies it if it's written in the 2nd century.
Right.
And secondly, Luke contradicts Paul. So the author of Luke Acts isn't familiar with Paul. So both the timing, the chronology, and the message itself disqualify Luke from actually being a companion of Paul who could have, who's telling anything close to an actual history of Paul's travels.
Yeah.
Which brings the Gospel of Luke into kind of some level of
suspicion.
Yeah,
basically, should we trust it at all?
Yeah,
is what she's getting at, and then the idea that it's possibly could be fiction or some cobbled together, unreliable mess written much later. We'll get to all that. Now, it's important because the legal aspect of our particular interest right now from this for the show is not to cross-examine whether or not Dr. Fredriksen is a bona fide expert qualified to give this opinion. She, in fact, is qualified to give this opinion. She's a legitimate scholar in her own right. She's the Aurelio Professor of Scripture Emerita at Boston University. No slouch, obviously. Yeah. Since 2009, she's been a distinguished visiting professor of comparative religion at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So she's got her bona fides. She definitely has that, and I don't want anybody to think that she's just some fringe person on this. But does that mean they ought to take her claims and just not subject them, I should say, to cross-examination? And of course, the answer is no. We should cross-examine everything, and in fact, cross-examine what we say here on this show. And we allow people to do that on Deliberations Live. They can ask us any question and cross-examine our claims as well. So just because someone's got a lot of letters after their name doesn't mean that they are not subject to cross-examination. But we have to take her claims seriously because she is a bona fide scholar. So we're going to cross-examine the particulars of what her claims are to see if they comport with history and the documents themselves. So we want to give a couple of summaries here. This is my opening statement. First, Dr. Fredriksen gives scant evidence to establish that Luke and Acts were written late. She gives scant evidence for this. If we use a timeline similar to the way lawyers and law enforcement create of known facts, we'll see a strong case for the fact that Luke and Acts were written quite early, well before the end of the 1st century, not in the 2nd century. And thirdly, Paul specifically mentions Luke as a companion in the letters that are indisputably ascribed to Paul. So he mentions Luke by name. And fourthly and finally, there are no real contradictions between Paul's own accounts and those in the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. And I think we'll establish those 4 points in particulars in the substance of our talk today.
Yeah. Well, before we go further, just want to, I've already mentioned it once, just want to remind everyone again, if you could, it really helps us out, and we hope it helps you out too. Click the bell, subscribe to the channel, follow our socials, which you should see on the screen right now, engage in the comments, and do that, and share this with your friends, because this is information that we feel really needs to get out there. But also when you do that, again, you'll be notified when we're going live. You'll be notified of new episodes, and you'll be notified essentially when you can engage with us on these and go even deeper into these. If you have more questions, great. If you have criticisms of us, even better. We want to hear them, and we want to answer those directly. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And if you're listening to the podcast, be sure to rate the podcast. That helps us out a lot too.
Yeah. All right. So Abdu, let's jump into some of let's put some meat on the bones of what you just said. What the first claim that Dr. Fredriksen makes is that the Gospel of Luke and Book of Acts were written too late to be based on eyewitnesses or a travel companion of Paul. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, she says, because of the dating issue that Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, therefore, were probably written in the 2nd century. He has to be long-lived or long-lived in order to be sort of a sarcastic remark
Sure.
that Paul couldn't have really had this author who lived 100 and something years be his travel companion. Well, now I want to address this by talking about a timeline, a way we can actually establish when the Gospel of Luke and Acts, the Book of Acts, were actually written, and we'll do it in a way that lawyers will create timelines and law enforcement will create timelines. And how we do that typically is you take an indisputable fact, a fact that everyone knows or no one disputes is true about the players in the story. And from there, you start to construct differences between, you start to construct a chronology between that fact, things that would have occurred after and things that would have occurred before that. So, for example, if you want to establish, was a person at a particular scene, whether it's in a civil suit or a criminal suit, was a person at the scene? And so we know, for example, that from, a time of death assessment by the coroner, that the person was murdered between, midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. So now the question is, can we put the suspect at the scene around then? Well, we don't have a whole lot of definitive answers just yet. So what we do is we say, this is the timeline. Between this time and this time is the established indisputable fact. We also have another indisputable fact. The problem is that that's about 2 hours in the past, where we saw the suspect at a certain spot. And we know that from video cam footage, whether it's, security cam or, someone's door ring thing or whatever it is, or cell phone data. We know where he was. Now, we have to account for the 2 hours now. And so what you do is you start to take as many indisputable facts as you possibly can and peg them in the timeline so that you get fewer disputable facts as possible, so that you narrow and narrow and narrow the timeline. And you take it from those indisputable facts. So let's take an indisputable fact then with regard to the life of Paul. And also we know the content of the Book of Acts. So two facts that no one disputes. One, that the author of Acts is the author of the Gospel of Luke. So there's part 1 and part 2.
Yeah.
That's indisputable fact 1. Indisputed fact 2 is that Paul died by execution around 65 AD. He certainly died, indisputably. No one challenges this, that Paul died by some form of execution within the 1st century. In fact, he has to have died within the 1st century. Otherwise, he would have lived for 100 and something years if he was living in the 2nd century. So that's not true. So he dies around 65 AD. That's a fact that no one really disputes. So if that's the case, if Paul dies around 65 AD and the Book of Acts, which is part 2 again to Luke and Acts, records Paul's missionary journeys, it records the stoning of Stephen, it records the first moments of the nascent church, it records names with details of what they went through, of beatings, who beat them, how they got beaten, whether it was stoned or it was whipped, it records shipwrecks, it records all these travails of all these characters, including Paul. It records the deaths of various figures as well, very important figures. It records all of that stuff. What does it not record? What is glaringly absent from the Book of Acts is Paul's death. Everything else about Paul's life is in there. And if it was written in the 2nd century, as Dr. Fredriksen and others might claim, you would expect that author to include the single most important fact about Paul's life other than his conversion, which is his martyrdom death. And it doesn't. It doesn't include that. So if you were to look back and say, let's say you had nothing else but those facts, that Luke and Acts were written by the same person, and Paul dies in 65 AD, and you read the Book of Acts and you didn't see Paul's death, when would be the natural conclusion? What would be the natural conclusion about the dating of the Book of Acts? You would naturally conclude that it was written before the death of the Apostle Paul, since it records everything about him, including the deaths of all people who did die, who were his peers or even his enemies at some point. You would include that, but it doesn't include that, which gives a strong suggestion that it was written well before the turn of the 2nd century, and likely well before 65 AD. So if the book of Acts was written before 65 AD, then the Gospel of Luke, which is part 1, was written well before that. So we have strong compelling reasons to believe that there is early dating for these books.
Yeah, and they were happy to talk about their martyrs too. It's not like they were trying to hide the fact that this man of God that somehow got killed. That shouldn't have happened because they'd already admitted Jesus did, which is kind of an embarrassing. If you look at it that way. What you wouldn't expect of your Savior, John the Baptist, Stephen, who we've already mentioned, and then the literature of that time and moving forward would highlight martyrs like Polycarp, Perpetua.
We hear of James being run through with the sword. I mean, it's not like this is a foreign concept. It's, in fact, in some ways, it's boasted about. The martyrdom's boasted about. So what you would expect, if martyrdom's such a big deal to Christians, and it clearly was, that you would include the martyrdom of the most influential Christian outside of Peter and Jesus himself to be mentioned. And yet it's not. Now, this is important for one other thing, too, because in her comments, Dr. Fredriksen actually makes the point. She said, Stephen's martyrdom, and we'll get to that in a minute, Stephen's martyrdom is not mentioned by Paul. Paul never mentions in his letters Stephen's martyrdom. But Luke does in the book of Acts. So, and the argument she's making is that you would think this important fact, part of Paul's biography, he would have mentioned in his letters. You'd think that. Now, that sounds similar to the argument I just made, right? You'd think that Paul's death would be mentioned. And so, wait a minute, Abdu, if that's somehow evidence for early dating, wouldn't that be evidence for a contradiction? The leaving something out that's important. You might think that, but they're not the same kind of thing. And we'll get to this a little bit later. But Paul is not in his letters writing a chronology. He's writing letters that include some biographical data, but not a comprehensive thing. You look at the book of Luke and the book of Acts, and you would never think that Luke is doing anything short of writing a chronology. And so he includes facts that are chronologically important, including Stephen's death, but not Paul's death. And that's why I think it's really important to see it.
And most likely the community in Galatia would have known about Stephen. He's kind of reminding them. He's like, as you know, of my past, but let me give you a little brief recap. Whereas we don't really know much about Theophilus. And it may have just been Luke is telling him everything that happened as if it's the first time he's hearing it, which is clearly what Luke and Acts are. They are a historical representation of So
absolutely
presentation.
I think what's important too is, and this is the second part of the claim, one of the claims we're going to make is that Paul actually mentions Luke. So not only do you have a timeline that establishes, I think in strong ways, that the book of Luke and Acts, the books of Luke and Acts were actually early, certainly within the first century. But Paul actually mentions Luke by name. He mentions him as a beloved fellow worker and steadfast friend in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, in 2 Timothy 4:11, and Philemon 1:24. Now, Philemon is an undisputed letter of Paul. No one thinks that Paul didn't write Philemon. And I think that Paul wrote all these things, but let's just take the skeptic at their word. This is an undisputed letter. And so we know that Luke was a friend because he wrote this letter. Paul wrote it, and he mentions Luke by specifically. Now, there's also no reason to name Luke as the gospel writer of the Gospel of Luke, because other than Paul's mention of him as his friend, Luke has no significance whatsoever. He has no clout, no credibility that somehow gives more like gravitas to this gospel.
Certainly not more than Paul.
Exactly. Yeah. Certainly not more than Paul. And in fact, you'll see it in the upper corner here. There's going to be a link to a episode where you and I talk about Dr. Bart Ehrman's claim that the Gospels weren't written by the people we think they were. And we have a lengthy discussion about why we can have strong reasons to believe that Luke was written by Luke.
Yeah, and actually, just as a teaser, there is some you can look in the Gospel of Luke and tell where his main sources of information are.
Yeah.
It seems to be women and Paul. So why not call it either the Gospel of either of the Marys, the two main Marys, or Paul. Either of those, any of those would have been a more influential name than Luke.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at these two claims, and we'll get to a couple more in a second here, but when you look at these two claims, the evidence from the timeline that puts Luke and Acts before the end of the 2nd century, and the fact that Paul mentions Luke specifically as a friend in an undisputed letter, all these undisputed facts, you have a strong case for believing that Luke and Acts were written in the 1st century, likely by somebody who actually did know Paul, because Paul mentions that person by name. Compare that with the scant evidence that I think Dr. Fredriksen gives, because her essential evidence, her essential claim is, well, the term Christian is popular, arises in the literature popularly in the 2nd century, and Luke also includes the word Christian, therefore it must be around the 2nd century. Right. And that's not, compared to the evidence we've already seen, that already by itself is not that great of evidence, but there's actually a good response to this.
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating too, because in the video, she gives 3 examples. Yeah. One of which is a Christian, Ignatius, but she gives 2 others, of Pliny and Tacitus. And you have to ask your question, well, these are non-Christian sources.
Right.
So essentially, these sources would not really see any reason to write about Christians until they became a nuisance. Yeah. Which happened about that time. In the 2nd century, numbers start growing, and because
influencing Rome.
There's even these authors will talk about how this superstition died down at first, but now it's rising back up.
Right.
And so that it's this clear sign that they're getting annoyed now at this group. And who is this group? Well, one says they're followers of Christus, and the others will say Christian. They start using this term Christian. So this word started as a term of derision, but the thing that Dr. Fredriksen doesn't mention is that it's also mentioned in 1 Peter. So it's not just in Luke. It's in another letter that you would then also have to try and date to the 2nd century. Yeah. Which it shouldn't be, but we're not talking about 1 Peter today.
But the point is, this stuff gets complicated. Yeah. Your explanation gets more and more complicated. Just saying Christian arose in the 2nd century doesn't solve it.
Yeah. And they're not even talking about it in the New Testament, like, hey, we're all Christians. They're sort of getting used to the fact that people are calling them these like Christian, which means like little Christs. Yeah. So it's a term of derision, and the fact that it shows up, even if you said, okay, you didn't have any until the 2nd century, 100 years later, but once it shows up there, that means it existed prior. Yeah. So all that means is we know it existed at least sometime before the first time it shows up in the 2nd century. Right. That's even if you give it that late date of starting in the 2nd century. So it says nothing about if Luke was written in the 1st century, that has to be a 2nd century term, just because in non-Christian usage, it started becoming sort of the nomenclature for this new group of people who follow this person that they call Christ.
Well, and go back to the timeline principle. So what all you get, the best you can get out of the fact that the word Christian shows up in non-Christian literature in the 2nd century is that it arose no later than the 2nd century. That's all you get, is that's the latest it could possibly have arisen. Yeah. You have no reason to believe that it didn't arise before that. This is and to think that it didn't just because the documents don't show that in terms of non-Christian writing has nothing to do with whether it showed up before that in verbal communication and oral transmission, or even in Gospels that maybe are actually dated earlier. Right. The whole idea is question begging.
Yeah. Abdu, let's jump into the second claim then, because and this is where I think a lot of people are going to be interested in, specifically in this part, because timelines, we get that can be kind of complex. Yeah. But if the message is in conflict, well, now we've got, that brings into mind inerrancy of the scriptures. Yeah. So this is, Christians are starting to get kind of nervous. Like, are there actual discrepancies? So the claim is basically that Luke contradicts Paul. So the author of Luke Acts isn't familiar with Paul. Can I read a quick summary from the video?
Of course.
We don't have to play it again. I just want to read real quick to remember what Dr. Fredriksen said. She said, so there's the gaps that Paul doesn't mention from Luke, and there are the collisions that Acts has with Paul's letters. And for that reason, I don't think the author of Luke was familiar with Paul's letters, or if he wasn't reading them very carefully.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we have to respond to here or understand is, as a matter of logic, just because there are some quote-unquote discrepancies, and I want to use that word very, very carefully. Discrepancy doesn't mean contradiction. It just means that this account and this account might not include the same facts. But a discrepancy to be a problem means they have to have contradictory facts.
Right.
And it's not even claimed, really, is that Paul doesn't mention Stephen by name, but Luke does. And somehow that's a discrepancy. It's not a discrepancy unless it's the kind of thing you absolutely would expect. He must say it. And if he doesn't say it, then that's inauthentic. Right. Like if someone were to ask me what my name was, and I said Abdu Murray, and then the next person asked me what my name is, and I say Abdu Hussein Murray, people are going to say, oh, no, the same guy didn't say it twice because he would have said his middle name, and he didn't say his middle name. I don't always have to say my middle name every time someone asks me a question about what my name is.
Right.
It's context specific. Maybe that moment I wanted to say it. Maybe someone was, state your full name. Who knows? So just because there's a discrepancy doesn't mean there's actually a contradiction or there's an unfamiliarity that the gospel writer and a writer of Acts was somehow unfamiliar with Paul, or Paul was unfamiliar with that person just because there's a discrepancy because a fact is left out.
Yeah.
Second is, so editorial selection is an important part of it. In fact, you'd expect some things, given the kind of writing that Luke and Acts are compared to what Paul was writing, you'd expect some actual differences in the chronologies, not in terms of contradictions, but just omissions or some level of compression of material.
And what's the point of the writing?
Yeah, exactly. What are you trying to get across?
Yeah.
Paul's letters are not chronological accounts. They are, I don't think they're dischronological. They could be achronological. In other words, he's not trying to tell you when this happened exactly in this order, except maybe when he is trying to give you a generalized view of how things happened. Most of these letters are to churches, well, all of them are to churches specifically for a reason, or to the pastoral epistles to Timothy and Titus and all this for a specific encouragement reason, exhortational reason, a theological treatise like the book of Romans, some philosophy thrown in. That's not what the book of Acts and Luke are about. Those aren't the primary reasons that those are written. So you have two different aims and intents behind these things. So if you didn't see differences, that would be surprising. But if you do see them, that's completely unsurprising, and it shouldn't surprise us at all. So a couple of things. If you look at Stephen's death, the fact that Paul doesn't mention Stephen by name, and of course, Luke in the book of Acts has Paul present at Stephen's death. And in fact, Paul says it in Acts chapter 22, verse 20, according to Luke. But Paul does mention that he persecuted the church. He mentions that he persecutes the church. Does he have to say every single thing he ever saw? We know he's not the one who stoned Stephen. He was there, and he was approving of what happened. We don't know if he sanctioned it. I don't even think he was doing his work specifically at the time of Stephen's martyrdom, so to speak. So Paul is speaking about his commissioned work and that how he was specifically tasked with persecuting the church and went ahead and did it. He doesn't have to mention it by name every single time he talks about it.
Would you say that one, sorry to interrupt, but that one's somewhat even on Christians too, because they try to make Paul seem so bad that they'll say Paul murdered Stephen.
Yeah.
And the text doesn't really quite say he took the stone and threw it at Stephen's head, and that was the death blow.
Well, I go even further. Christians sometimes will take liberties with the text. Not in terms of understanding the text, they just won't quote it accurately because they say Paul murdered Christians. Paul secured the imprisonment of Christians, and who knows what's going to happen after that. But we don't have any evidence that Paul actually murdered anybody.
Right. There's some very violent things that may have taken place, but what exactly happened?
Yeah. And he was involved in a persecution of the church in some way. So this goes back to, he doesn't have to mention Stephen by name. And as you had said earlier, in Galatians, when he's writing to a church who is probably already familiar. Well, they're definitely familiar with Paul and his authority because he's writing to a church that he started. Yeah. And he's probably given them the whole history. They probably know how the church started, and Stephen's martyrdom. Does he have to give jot and tittle every single time he gives it? Of course he doesn't. But the fact that he generally mentions the persecution he was a part of would naturally call to mind in the minds of his readers and his hearers that Stephen was a part of that.
Right.
But he doesn't have to mention him by name. Just like I don't have to mention my middle name every time someone asks me what my name actually is.
Well, and I just want to mention too, real quick, for those following in their Bible, Acts 9:1, it says Saul was breathing out murderous threats.
Yeah.
Which is different than saying specifically Paul was going around murdering people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's a chief sinner.
Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but the details are not quite there.
We have to be careful.
We have to be careful.
Don't go beyond what the text allows you to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in this sense, Dr. Fredriksen's guilty of that because she has said he must have he must mention Stephen if it actually happened.
Right.
He doesn't have to. And in fact, he does generally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so, the other thing that I want to talk about then, but before we kind of close up and give closing arguments, is really this idea that Paul, the discrepancy or the real contradiction that they seem to find is, where did Paul go after this experience in Damascus? Did he go to Arabia, then back to Damascus, then to Jerusalem, or did he go immediately to Jerusalem?
Right.
And the interesting thing is that where they say, Paul says here that he went immediately to Jerusalem, whereas in Galatians, he'll say he went to Arabia first, then back to Damascus, then to in Acts, there is actually, in those parts where they're talking about, and I'm going to go through one quickly, there is no indication of a chronological time. It's just, and at some point, essentially, he ends up in Jerusalem. So in Acts 9, it's interesting because Luke in this chapter is helping us locate temporally, sort of through Paul's speech and through narrative, where Paul is, what's happening right after the next thing, right?
Yeah.
So it'll say something like, immediately scales fell from Paul's eyes in 9:18. He spent several days in Damascus with the disciples, 9:19. After many days, quote unquote, of his preaching, there arose a conspiracy to kill Paul in 9:23. But when it gets to his visit to Jerusalem, all it says is when he came to Jerusalem. There is no immediately or a few days later, or there is a difference. It's almost as if Luke goes out of his way at this point not to say that it happened quickly, whereas up until then, this has been an action-packed event where this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and when he came to Jerusalem. So Luke was condensing many years, perhaps, these decades of the early church and what was going on. And he doesn't start with Paul, but eventually it comes to Paul. First, he's kind of traveling. You get the idea that he's either hearing stories of or traveling with Peter and John. Then he meets up with Paul. And then the rest of Acts is really about Paul's missionary journeys. Now, in Galatians, where the contradiction allegedly is, Paul seems to fill out a few more of the details. Because Acts is like 30,000 feet, a broad history of a large period of time. For the sake of establishing his bona fides in the Galatia region, and in his letter to the Galatians, because they were having an issue with some heresy going on there, and he was trying to establish his bona fides as an apostle who came about in kind of a miraculous way. Yeah. This miraculously being chosen by Jesus on the road to Damascus. He doesn't get taught by the apostles right away. He goes into Arabia, and you get the idea that he's received a message from Jesus. He's being taught by the Spirit. And then he comes, and when he finally meets an apostle for the first time, he says, oh, by the way, here's what I've been preaching. Am I right? Am I wrong? I don't want to get it wrong. They're like, they had no changes to make. Right. So he's saying, so I'm someone you should really be listening to, not these false teachers who are coming around. So because of that, he seems to focus in on where Luke is giving this large timeline here and kind of broad strokes. Paul says, now let's focus right here for a second. And let's focus right here too for a second.
Just pause for a moment. Yeah. Because what you said is so important. Luke is giving a chronology of the acts of, that's why it's called the book of Acts, the acts of the apostles, plural, not just Paul.
Not just Paul.
He talks about Peter, he talks about a whole lot about a bunch of people.
Right.
So you'd expect there to be summarizations of what's going on. Yeah. And when Paul's talking about himself, to give his bona fide.
For a specific reason. Yeah.
Right. Now you'd expect more detail. And he gives that very detail. So the facts are exactly where you expect them to be, given the kind of thing you're reading.
Exactly. So I would just tell everyone who's wanting to go to Acts 9 and 22 and 26, and then go to Galatians. But when you read Acts, when you hear something like, and then this happened, if you think it means immediately, really look into you can a little bit of, you can learn just enough Greek to be dangerous sometimes, but you can find these words that, and you can see, okay, there's definitely, this is saying something happened very soon after. This is just saying at some point this happened.
Exactly.
And sometimes we read into that because of the way we tell stories.
Yeah.
So if I said, and then I did this, and then I did that, but it depends also on the context. So, I gave an example of, here's a few things where my biography would not be full of contradictions, but it would look very different and very different details given. So a resume, if I'm applying to a new job, let's say at a biological lab or for an apologetics organization, I could apply to both. They would both look very different based on what experience I want to highlight for that specific person. A CV, which has basically everything you've ever done.
Yeah. Curriculum vitae. In other words, very detailed work history and academic history and all that.
If I wrote the back of a book, if I wrote a whole book, but on the back of the book, it would have a brief bio. IRS records would have a different sort of work history than what I'm putting on the back of my book.
Yeah.
On the back of my book, I wouldn't say that I worked at Walmart or that my first job was in landscaping and I got fired after about 3 weeks. I would leave that out. Very embarrassing.
Yeah.
I could not hack it, but I was only like 14. I mean,
we'll forgive you.
Yeah. And then talking to a therapist, again, very different details that you'd be giving for specific purposes. So they're all biographical, and all would give different details. So Luke and Paul are writing to different audiences for different purposes. And that's all that's happening. When you actually match them up and read them very carefully and don't let your brain sort of fill in details that aren't there, like our brains are good at doing and for good reason at times, but really match them up, you'll find that there are no actual contradictions.
Yeah.
And they match up actually quite beautifully.
Well, and considering the purpose, they match up quite beautifully, especially considering the documents that they are. And this is exactly what you expect. It's funny. I was thinking about as you were sharing just now, I was thinking also about cross-examination. I remember, so good friends of mine, Nabil Qureshi and David Wood, were put on trial. It's fairly famous for doing some preaching.
Great YouTube video.
Yeah. Lots of views. They actually were put on trial for a criminal matter for actually disturbing the peace or whatever the charge was based on preaching at a festival. And the chief of police, I think I have this right. I wasn't at the actual trial, so I can't tell you this is what happened from firsthand knowledge. I was told this, is that at some point, the chief of police was put on the stand and shown the video, because there's a lot of video footage of this particular incident. And Nabil and David's lawyer said, okay, I want you to show me when a crime happens. He's playing the video. And then they get arrested. He goes, wait, something like this. Like, wait, they arrested him for that? And in other words, he never saw what he was expecting to see, which is a crime happened in the video. I think the similar thing would happen here where, can you show me, when I'm going to read out loud the account in the book of Acts, can you show me where it says immediately?
Yeah.
And I'm going to wait. I'll wait. And then you'll never hear anything. So if I was to cross-examine Dr. Fredriksen or anybody for that matter on this particular passage, I'd say, okay, I'm going to read it out loud. You stop me when it says he immediately went to Jerusalem. And I'd read it.
Yeah.
And it's, well, when? Well, it had to be implied. You'd have to come up with an implication of it. It just doesn't work. You'd have to imply it, and you'd have to want there to be a discrepancy between the two things, when in fact there is none by the text.
Yeah, and just as I can say, I used to live in Indiana, and then I lived in Michigan. I could also say I used to live in Indiana, then I lived in Illinois, then back in Indiana, then in Wisconsin, then in Georgia, then in Michigan. Both are true.
Yeah. And neither one of them's a lie.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, yeah, well, Abdu, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I think, can you help sort of give your final closing thoughts, help to pull this thing together? Because there's a lot of strands. And again, like I said, we will be going live a week from now. So for anyone who wants to unravel another one of those threads and discuss it, we can do that. But what would you just leave people with today?
Absolutely. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard a lot in response to some specific claims that Dr. Paula Fredriksen, who is a bona fide actual scholar, has made, and claims that the books of Luke and the book of Acts can't possibly be written by a travel companion of Paul because, one, the book of Acts was written in the 2nd century and the book of Luke likely as well. And two, there are discrepancies between what the book of Acts says about Paul and what Paul says about himself are. So either they're too late or they're discrepancies or likely both. What we've seen, ladies and gentlemen, is that neither one of these two claims has any real evidence in their favor that is substantial enough to overcome the great weight of the evidence that goes in favor of the fact that the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written in the 1st century. What we established was there is a timeline, a timeline based on an undisputed fact about Paul's life. Paul died in the 1st century, likely at 65 AD or so. And the book of Acts, which lists a bunch of details about not only Paul's life, but a bunch of different people's lives who were in the early church, from their persecutions and their beatings and their deaths, it just simply doesn't include Paul's death. If it was written in the 2nd century, decades after Paul's death, you'd think that this book would include Paul's death, considering how important a player Paul was in the narrative, yet it doesn't include it. So you are more than reasonable to conclude that the book of Acts and Luke were written before the turn of the 2nd century. Second is that just because the book of Acts mentions the word Christians, and you see the word Christians show up in the literature in the 2nd century from non-Christian sources, doesn't mean that somehow the book of Acts is now also a 2nd century book. You have to assume that any book that mentions Christians has to be in the 2nd century because other books that mention Christians are in the 2nd century. You have to make an assumption, and this is circular reasoning. If you assume that the book of Acts has to be 2nd century. Why? Because it uses the term Christians. Why is that important? Because Christians was only used in the 2nd century. How do you know that? Because only documents in the 2nd century used it. But what if the book of Luke and the book of Acts is a 1st century document? Well, we can't do that. Why not? Because we assume it's not. You see how circular that reasoning actually is. And so that falls apart as well. Also, the discrepancies. The discrepancies simply aren't there. That's the third point I want to make, is that the discrepancies actually aren't there. That Luke mentions Stephen's martyrdom by name, has Paul mentioning Stephen's martyrdom by name in the book of Acts, and yet Paul doesn't mention him by name. Well, Paul mentions the persecutions generally. Given the kinds of documents that are being written, Paul's letters are not meant to be detailed chronologies of what he did. And Luke's books in Luke and Acts are relatively detailed chronologies of what happened, not with just Paul, but other people. The fact that Paul mentions persecutions and that Luke mentions a specific persecution of Stephen's martyrdom doesn't equate to a discrepancy. It simply is a consistency where one puts more detail in than the other, and that's not a problem at all. So I think what we can see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is that given the weight of the evidence in favor of an early dating of the book of Luke, oh, by the way, the fact that Paul actually mentions Luke by name in his letters, and the fact that there are no discrepancies, and the fact that there's no reason to believe that just because 2nd century documents mentions the word Christians, that the word Christian wasn't in circulation in the 1st century, I think we can see that there are compelling reasons to believe not only that the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke that came before it were written early, but also written by a travel companion of Paul, and weren't in fact fiction, but are recorded history. So that's the story, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's up for you to decide, and we'll look forward to seeing you at deliberations where we can hash out more of the detail of this discussion there. So see you at deliberations.